The heiress was stripped bare, her mansion seized by creditors, her life reduced to nothing. Then the man she barely saw, the lowly butler, emerged from the shadows with a single astonishing act. He bought back her home and handed her the deed. He shattered her expectations, and everything changed. Hello, dear listener. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden fortunes, class barriers, and transformative love, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of desire, redemption, and startling turnarounds. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments which character's secret you're most eager to uncover. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Arabella Kent stood by the fountain in the heart of the garden, the damp autumn air clinging to the skirts of her last good blue gown. The house behind her, the gables, was silent, the windows like cold, judging eyes. Though the estate was magnificent, it felt like a collapsing tower, its foundation crumbling with each tick of the clock. The morning light struggled to warm the stone terrace where the auctioneer had stood just yesterday, casting long shadows across the immaculate, yet now meaningless, grounds. Arabella traced her finger along the lip of the fountain, leaving a clean line through the dew. Even the perfection of this garden felt like a cruel joke, mocking the ruin of its mistress. She had woken as always in the east wing bedroom, the same silk sheets, the same massive four-poster bed, the same view of the grounds she could no longer call her own. Her reflection in the Venetian mirror showed her what she had become. An exile, too distraught, her composure fractured beneath her fair complexion. Dark circles shadowed the eyes that had once held the spark of inherited arrogance, now dulled by humiliation and sheer panic. Her long, brown hair was tangled, hastily pinned up. 26 years old, and she had lost everything. After throwing a last, futile glance toward the empty drawing room, where Maxwell Thorne had signed the final papers, she performed her desperate ritual. From the small pocket of her gown, she withdrew the heavy, ornate key to the main gates. For years, it had been a symbol of her ownership. Now it was just a piece of metal belonging to another man. She curled her hand around it, the sharp edges digging into her palm. She had ruined her family, destroyed her legacy. The wind, crisp and carrying the scent of dying leaves and expensive damp earth, wrapped around Arabella Kent as she stood by the massive Italianate fountain. She was not praying. Prayer was for the penitent, and her sin, she had finally admitted to herself, was not one of morality but of entitlement. Her ruin had been built not on malicious acts, but on a lifetime of careless assumptions that the world and the gables would simply stay where she left it. She stood in the center of the moss-flecked cobblestones, her face turned up to the weak morning sun, but the gesture was not one of defiance. It was a desperate attempt to memorize the light, the exact pitch of the cascading water, the way the ancient ivy clung to the mansion's stone facade. She was dressed in the rustic blue gown, a garment that had once been considered a bohemian, comfortable choice for a morning spent reading in the sunroom, but now felt like a costume for a tragic play. Its fine linen was a stark, almost insulting contrast to the gnawing anxiety that had been her sole companion for the past 48 hours. Her flowing brown hair, usually attended to by a maid, was haphazardly secured, a few strands already escaping to frame a face drawn taut by sleeplessness and fear. The image she presented was one of distraught frustration and vulnerability, a raw portrait of a goddess suddenly thrown from her pedestal. The Gables. The name was now a mocking echo. It had been her fortress, her legacy, and her greatest failing. Every window, every stretch of polished mahogany, every inherited tapestry represented a resource she had squandered or leveraged into nothingness. She had seen the house not as a responsibility, but as an infinite ATM, a boundless source of wealth that could sustain a lifestyle built on whims and carelessness. She had believed, with the unshakable arrogance of the truly pampered, that the sheer age of the Kent family name would somehow repel the cold arithmetic of debt. She had been wrong. Yesterday, The auctioneer's final rap of the gavel had sounded less like a wooden thud and more like the cracking of her own spine. She hadn't stayed for the spectacle, fleeing instead to the deepest, most neglected corner of the garden, where the privet hedges grew wild and concealed the crumbling, silent evidence of her family's long-term neglect. But she had been summoned back. The paperwork, the final, humiliating signatures that transferred the very soil beneath her feet, were to be completed this morning. Maxwell Thorne, the cold financier who had orchestrated her downfall, insisted on it being done on the premises. A symbolic victory, she knew, one last twist of the knife to remind her who, exactly, had won. A flicker of movement caught her eye, a shadow within the deep, arched entry of the main hall, perfectly framed by the wrought iron scrollwork. It was Elias North. Elias, the man she had called Butler for the last 10 years, though never by his name if she could help it. He stood with the formal posture of his role, a figure of immutable professionalism. Today, he wore his finest dark formal attire, perfectly tailored, every crease sharp, every button gleaming. His expression, when she managed to catch a glimpse of it before he meticulously looked away, was keen, thoughtful, and reserved. He was the perfect example of the invisible man. The one who had served her breakfast, polished her silver, driven her to disastrous meetings, and overheard every hushed, frantic phone call she had made in the last year of financial meltdown. He had been an audience to her entire slow-motion catastrophe, and she had never once considered him a person with opinions, feelings, or, God forbid, a life outside of the service bell. To Arabella, he was merely a highly functional piece of expensive furniture. His silence now felt like a heavy shroud. She wished he would leave, but he was always there, a silent sentinel of her failure. She turned her gaze back to the fountain. The internal monologue was frantic, a whirl of denial and self-pity. It's just a house. It's just bricks and mortar. I can rebuild. I have my name. But the name was tarnished. The resources were gone. And the house was not just bricks and mortar. It was the physical manifestation of her identity, the only thing she had ever truly valued, or at least, the only thing that had ever truly given her value in the eyes of the world. Now, she was nothing more than a woman with a few suitcases and a mountain of social shame. She remembered the look on Maxwell Thorne's face yesterday. Not rage, not glee, just cold, professional satisfaction. Thorne was a financial predator, a man of ruthless calculation who had seen the Kent family's weakness and struck with surgical precision. He didn't care about the history of the Gables. He cared about its liquidation value, the subdivision potential, the square footage. Thorne represented the future. Cold, hard, and devoid of sentiment. Arabella represented the past. Soft, reckless, and entirely dependent on sentiment. The heavy, rhythmic crunch of tires on the gravel drive announced his arrival. Arabella straightened her spine, a desperate, futile attempt to conjure the haughty confidence that had been her shield for so long. She smoothed the skirt of her blue gown, trying to anchor herself in the remnants of her composure. She would not cry. She would not beg. She would take this final, mortal blow with a cold dignity worthy of the name she was about to lose. The car, a severe, black-town car that seemed designed to absorb light, pulled up directly in front of the main entrance. Maxwell Thorne emerged slowly, a heavy-set man in dark, expensive clothes. He was flanked by two equally severe-looking men, his legal entourage, who carried slim, dark leather briefcases, the vessels of her doom. Thorne did not glance at the garden or the architecture. His gaze was fixed on the entry, on the business at hand. Elias North, perfectly timed, stepped forward from the archway to open the door wider for Thorne and his associates. A final, perverse act of service to the man who had just dismantled his employer's life. He executed the movement with flawless grace, making the financier feel welcomed into the house that was no longer Arabella's. It was a horrifying intimacy, witnessing her servant attend to the enemy. Arabella forced her feet to move, marching toward the house. She couldn't hear the voices, but she could feel the cold, corporate air that Thorne brought with him, an atmosphere that suffocated the last vestiges of the Gables' warmth. She met them just inside the drawing room door, the room where she had once hosted extravagant summer balls. Now it was stripped of its character, prepared for the transaction. The atmosphere was purely transactional. "Miss Kent?" Thorne greeted her, his voice a low, gravelly monotone, devoid of malice but also of any human sympathy. He looked at her with the professional indifference of a butcher looking at a side of beef. "We are simply here to finalize the transfer of the last few assets. Standard procedure. Will you be available for the final walkthrough?" "There will be no walkthrough, Mr. Thorne," Arabella said, her voice surprisingly steady, though she felt a tremor running up her arms. "I have no desire to see what you intend to do with what was mine." Thorne gave the faintest of nods, acknowledging her small defiance as irrelevant. "As you wish. The final documents have been signed by your representatives and notarized. All that remains is the ceremonial transfer of the last physical asset." He looked pointedly at the small, heavy object clutched in her hand. Arabella's breath hitched. She hadn't realized she was still holding the key to the main gates. She had held it all morning, a heavy, cold comfort. It was the last token of her authority. "The key, Miss Kent?" Thorne prompted, holding out a large, pale hand. The world seemed to tilt. This was the moment of absolute, undeniable surrender. Her internal voice screamed, "Don't give it to him. Run. Throw it into the fountain." But her body betrayed her, moving on autopilot. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, loosened. She dropped the key directly into Maxwell Thorne's hand. The sound of metal hitting flesh was terribly loud in the silent room. Thorne did not look at her face. He merely curled his fingers around the key, a gesture of absolute, possessive ownership, before dropping it into his pocket with a decisive click that resonated like the slamming of a prison door. "Thank you, Miss Kent. We will proceed with the immediate cataloging of the contents." He turned to his men. "Gentlemen, the inventory begins now. Ensure no personal effects remain. The house must be vacated completely by noon." Thorne, without another word, turned and walked away, his two associates following, their briefcases swinging with their determined strides. They were already moving, already taking possession. The Gables was already gone. Arabella stood perfectly still in the empty doorway, her blue gown feeling ridiculously conspicuous against the shadowed backdrop of the hall. She was paralyzed, a statue of absolute defeat. The clock in the hall, a grandfather clock that had ticked through 4 generations of Kents, felt loud, mocking her lost time. Noon. She had less than 2 hours to remove herself entirely from the life she had been born into. The last of Thorne's entourage disappeared into the vast library. Only then did Elias North move. He did not approach her. He did not offer comfort. He simply returned to his spot near the archway, his dark suit blending into the shadow of the stone. His gaze, however, was now fixed fully on her. It was not the impersonal gaze of the servant, nor the cold assessment of the creditor. It was the gaze of a man witnessing an event he had anticipated, a necessary destruction he had waited years to see. There was a raw, intense concern in his eyes, but it was hardened by something she could not decipher. A silent, intense purpose. He was maintaining his distance, but his presence was anything but invisible now. He saw her, truly saw her, in her ultimate moment of failure. Arabella's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. She did not weep dramatic tears. Instead, a choked, agonizing sound escaped her. A sound of pure, helpless despair. She turned blindly, stumbling away from the house, back toward the garden. She rushed past the fountain, past the manicured hedges, until she reached the far gate. The one she had always known was broken and rusting. She pushed her fingers through the cold ironwork, gripping the bars as if they could keep her from floating away. She had to go. She had no money, only the few pieces of jewelry she wore and a small, hastily packed bag of clothes. She had no immediate destination. Her family's few remaining contacts had long since vanished the moment the debt became public. She was utterly, completely alone. She was not just homeless. She was without identity. The heiress was gone. Behind her, Elias stood in the archway, perfectly still, watching her figure shrink against the vastness of the lost estate. He watched the way her shoulders shook, the way she finally dropped her head against the cool metal of the gate, conceding defeat not to Thorn, but to her own catastrophic recklessness. He had served the Kent family since he was 20, watching Arabella grow from a spoiled child into an entitled young woman. He had seen the goodness beneath the arrogance, the sharp intelligence dulled by laziness, and the capacity for love buried beneath layers of self-absorption. He had loved her, silently, deeply, for years, the way a humble gardener loves an unreachable star. He had waited for this day, not because he wanted to see her suffer, but because he knew, with a certainty that fueled his own secret life, that Arabella Kent could only be reborn from the absolute, crushing finality of total loss. Elias North stepped back further into the shadow of the archway, his hand moving automatically to his inner breast pocket, where the real papers, were neatly folded. The other deed. He would give her the requisite time to feel the sting of her defeat, to taste the dust of humble living. Only then, when she was truly ready to see a man, not a servant, would he step forward. Arabella, oblivious to the secret hidden in her former butler's pocket, pushed herself away from the gate. She took a final, desperate look at the house, her house now Maxwell Thorne's property, and turned her back on it, walking out of the garden and toward the long, dusty road that led away from the gables. Elias watched her go until the blue of her gown disappeared behind the ancient oak at the property line. Only then, with the house silent save for the methodical, inventory-taking presence of Thorne's men, did he walk out into the sunlight. He looked down the road where Arabella had walked, then back up at the majestic, purchased facade of the gables. He was no longer the butler. He was the master, and the ultimate confrontation, the true reversal of their two lives, was yet to come. Elias North did not move until the blue speck of Arabella's retreating figure had been swallowed by the dense curve of the sycamores. He remained by the archway, letting the cold air from the drawing-room settle. The scent of dust and failure hung heavy, but beneath it, Elias could detect the faintest trace of the expensive French perfume Arabella favored, a perfume that had always symbolized her casual, careless luxury. He closed his eyes briefly, committing the moment to memory, securing the image of her defeat not with pity, but with a complex sense of fulfillment. This was the completion of the first phase of his 10-year strategy. He had often been asked how he managed to maintain such composure, such immaculate neutrality, during the Kent's slow-motion financial suicide. The secret was simple. He had never been truly present. His body was in the hall, serving the sherry, but his mind, his true essence, was miles away, charting a different course, a course built not on the fickle whims of inherited fortune but on the iron logic of the market. Elias had been hired by Lord Kent, Arabella's father, a man whose primary role was to slowly and charmingly accelerate the family's decline. At the age of 20, he came from a solid, respectable, though not wealthy, background. He had chosen the path of service not out of necessity, but out of a calculating desire for proximity. He had been introduced to Arabella Kent at a society function before taking the post, catching a glimpse of her wit and energy before it was buried under the trappings of her entitlement. He had seen the raw potential, the fiery core that her privilege was actively smothering. His service was impeccable. He was the perfect butler, silent, anticipatory, and utterly invisible. He mastered the minutiae of the Kent household, the preferred temperature of the claret, the exact angle for the morning paper, the subtle cues of boredom or irritation on Arabella's face. He knew the house better than she did, noting which chandeliers needed rewiring, which sections of the roof were leaking, and which antiques Arabella was most likely to sell off during her next spending spree. But while he served the family, he was serving his own agenda. His life, secreted away in the small, immaculate quarters above the scullery, was a study in stark contrast to the mansion's extravagance. While Arabella and her circle discussed the latest Paris fashions and expensive country pursuits, Elias was submerged in the world of trade. He devoured financial newspapers by the dim light of his small desk lamp. He used the connections afforded by his position, the occasional overheard conversations with visiting merchants, the casual advice given by wealthy, careless clients, to fuel his independent investments. His initial capital had been painfully saved from his meager wages, augmented by shrewd, early ventures in the booming colonial import-export trade. Arabella, of course, had no idea. She saw the butler. She saw the livery. She saw the bowed head. She never once saw the disciplined intellect that was calculating arbitrage opportunities in the Far East or tracking the fluctuating price of commodities. Elias recalled a dinner party 2 years prior, where Arabella, bored, had been discussing her latest indulgence, a completely unnecessary stable of horses. He had stood perfectly still by the sideboard, pouring a glass of Madeira, as she had casually dismissed the cost. "Oh, the estate will cover it. Elias, darling, fetch me the silver ledger, will you? Just to show me the numbers look pretty." He had brought the ledger. The numbers were catastrophic, a dizzying spiral of diminishing returns and compounding interest on poorly structured loans. But she hadn't looked at the red ink. She had only looked at the column labeled assets and smiled, thinking of it as an inexhaustible magical reservoir. "Thank you, Elias. You may go," she had said, not looking up. That night, Elias hadn't slept. He realized she was not just irresponsible. She was willfully, arrogantly blind. She wouldn't slow down. She couldn't. To stop spending would be to admit the illusion was cracking. It was then, seeing the rapid acceleration of the Kent family's debt, that Elias made his quiet, irreversible decision. He would let it all burn, and then he would rebuild it. His investments grew geometrically. His focus shifted from modest returns to aggressive, calculated growth. He leveraged small amounts, poured his profits into stable, high-yield ventures, not the risky, showy deals that attracted Arabella's father, but the quiet, foundational assets of the industrial age: railroads, grain shipping, and insurance. He used a series of shell companies and offshore accounts, meticulously hiding the true source and volume of his wealth. The entire Kent household, including their battery of lawyers and accountants, remained utterly unaware that the man serving them tea held a net worth many times greater than their entire crumbling estate. His motivation was often misread, even by himself. Was it simple, secret love? Certainly, the sight of Arabella, vibrant and witty, even when she was carelessly dismissing him, was a constant, painful draw. But his deeper motivation was corrective. He loved the potential of Arabella, the woman she could be if stripped of the toxic armor of her class. He needed her to be humble, to be grateful, to be equal. She would never respect him as a butler, and she would never respect herself as a privileged debtor. She had to learn the value of the home and the man she had taken for granted. For months, he had tracked the financial distress signals, the increasingly frantic letters from Maxwell Thorne, the frantic, hushed conversations Arabella had taken late at night in the library, and the quiet desperation in her father's eyes before he finally retreated into a comfortable, alcoholic oblivion. Elias knew the exact day the final default would occur. He knew when Thorne would put the property up for a short-notice private auction to cover the defaulted bonds. Yesterday, that day had arrived. Elias had prepared with the same precision he used to plan a state dinner. He called his solicitor, a small, discreet man named Mr. Finch, instructing him on the necessary documents and the final bid sealing. He told Lord Kent and Arabella that he required the afternoon off to attend to a pressing family matter in the city. They had barely registered his request, consumed as they were by the final, frantic attempts to secure a last-minute loan. Attempts Elias knew were doomed. He left the Gables not through the servants' exit, but by a discreet side gate, driving a hired, unremarkable sedan that he parked several blocks away from the auction house. He shed the butler's attire for a suit of expensive, dark wool, a suit that marked him not as a servant, but as a serious, wealthy participant in the city's financial games. He walked into the marble-floored hall of the auction house, entirely unrecognizable to the few people who might have known him at the Gables. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with the smell of old money and avarice. The auction was small, attended primarily by financiers and developers, men like Maxwell Thorne, who saw the Gables only as a prize to be dismantled and profitable asset to be leveraged. Elias positioned himself in the back, observing. Maxwell Thorne, seated confidently in the front row, was clearly the expected winner. He was the creditor. His bid would likely be a mere formality, recovering his investment and turning a tidy profit. The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and eyes that tracked dollar signs, began the proceedings. The initial bids were sluggish, placeholders really, as everyone waited for Thorne to set the pace. Thorne began with a high, commanding bid, well below the estate's true value, but high enough to scare off the amateurs. Property developer countered weakly. Thorne, with a lazy flick of his hand, raised the bid significantly. Done. Let's not waste the afternoon, gentlemen. His tone suggested he was dealing with children. It was at this point that Elias, from the obscurity of the back row, lifted his hand, a silent, almost imperceptible gesture, and raised Thorne's offer by a substantial margin. A murmur ran through the room. Thorne, annoyed, craned his neck, trying to identify the unexpected competitor. He saw only a man in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the auctioneer. Thorne raised the bid again, his face tightening. $5 million over that. Elias, without hesitation, countered, adding another significant sum. His goal was not to simply win. His goal was to win decisively, making it clear that he possessed the financial depth to sustain the purchase without strain. He wanted to make Thorne pay dearly for his arrogance, showing that not all quiet money belonged to old families. The bidding war continued for a grueling 5 minutes. Thorne became visibly agitated, his cold composure finally cracking. He could not understand who was challenging him with such reckless ease. He didn't know the bidder, and the amount was quickly spiraling beyond the easy profit margin he had anticipated. Finally, Thorne delivered his ultimate, frustrated bid, a gesture of sheer dominance. He then glared at the man in the back. Elias waited 3 beats, allowing the tension to coil, and then, with the same quiet certainty he used to lay out Arabella's morning silver, he raised his hand one last time. He gave a final, winning figure that silenced the room and pushed the total sale price several million above Thorne's final valuation. The auctioneer, stunned but jubilant at the unexpected windfall, slammed the gavel down. Sold. To the gentleman in the back. Elias had won. The Gables was now his. He had not paused to bask in the victory. He quickly finalized the paperwork through Mr. Finch, who was equally stunned by the scope of Elias's wealth. He secured the necessary deeds and documents, bundling them into a neat, secure packet. He then slipped out, before Thorne could recover enough to pursue a confrontation or demand his identity. He returned to the Gables and reassumed the livery of the butler, sliding back into the perfect camouflage of his position. He was present just moments after Arabella had surrendered the key to Thorne, witnessing her final public defeat. The shock, the anguish, the humiliation. He saw it all, and it was a necessary ingredient in the alchemical process of her redemption. Now, standing alone in the archway, Elias touched the hidden deed in his pocket. It felt like a stone of immense power. The Gables was his. Arabella, the spoiled heiress, was gone. replaced by a destitute, humbled woman. The man she thought she knew was gone, replaced by a wealthy, determined buyer. The game had changed entirely. Elias North stepped fully out of the shadows. He looked down the road one last time. The road was empty. Arabella was walking the path of poverty, a path he had silently engineered for her benefit. He turned and walked into the drawing room, where the ghosts of Arabella's reckless past still lingered. He had bought her home back. Now he intended to buy her soul, not with money, but with the painful, necessary lessons of equality and hard-won respect. He had waited 10 years for her to become worthy of the house, and more importantly, worthy of the man who had always been standing silently in the archway. His devotion had been a slow-burn fire, and now, finally, he was ready to use its heat to forge a future for them both. He smiled, a slow, predatory expression that the Kents had never once seen on their butler's face. The real service was about to begin. Elias North, dressed in a suit that spoke of quiet, generational wealth rather than a servant's wage, stood at the periphery of the auction hall. The room was heavy with the scent of leather, tobacco, and high finance. A world Arabella Kent, in her pampered ignorance, had thought she controlled, but which was now coldly dismantling her life. He was a phantom, observing the execution of a plan he had constructed with surgical patience. His chosen attire and demeanor were meticulous camouflage. He wore no distinctive jewelry, no flash of color. His expression was a blank slate of serious financial interest, one of many men gathered to prey on the carcass of the Kent fortune. If Arabella had walked into this room, she would have dismissed him as just another city man, an indistinct figure of commerce. She would never have recognized the man who ironed her linens and poured her morning coffee. The object of the day's proceedings, the Gables, was projected onto a screen behind the auctioneer. A stately, sepia photograph of the mansion at its zenith, a cruel, glossy reminder of what was about to be irreversibly lost. The air crackled with a greedy anticipation that Elias found repulsive, yet entirely necessary. Maxwell Thorne was seated in the front row, an island of arrogant calm amidst the low hum of conversation. Thorne, the lead creditor, embodied the cold, calculating force that Arabella was incapable of combating. He glanced at his gold watch, conveying his impatience. He was not here to participate in a market. He was here to finalize a predetermined transaction. The auctioneer, a man with the theatricality of a salesman and the eyes of a tax collector, launched into his spiel, detailing the acreage, the historical significance, and the sheer potential of the Gables for development. He omitted, of course, the fact that the house was deeply neglected and the estate mired in litigation. The bidding began low and tentative. The initial figures were merely the price of entry, offers from small-time developers hoping for a miracle or a mistake. Thorne ignored them. "We begin at 50 million, the auctioneer declared, his voice booming. 55, called a man near the front. 60, from the back. The bidding crawled, the auctioneer working hard to create energy that wasn't there. Everyone knew the real game would begin when Thorne entered. Finally, Thorne lifted a hand encased in a pristine white cuff. His voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly through the hall, laced with an inflection of absolute authority. 75 million. The bid was precise, designed to signal a level of commitment that most in the room could not meet, establishing the new baseline. It was a recovery figure, the amount he needed to recoup his various loans and costs, plus a reasonable margin for his time. He settled back, expecting silence. A small-time developer, clearly struggling with his internal calculus, pushed the bid to 76. Thorne didn't even turn. He simply raised his hand again. 80 million. His tone was bored, suggesting the conversation was over. A tense silence descended. The auctioneer waited, his eyes sweeping the room, practically begging for another player. He looked toward the back, where Elias stood, a figure of profound stillness. Elias had calculated this moment meticulously. He knew Thorne's break-even point and his target profit margin. He didn't want to simply outbid him. He wanted to shatter Thorne's expectation of an easy win. He wanted the house to be secured at a price that would make the Kent family's debt look trivial, ensuring that the purchase was absolutely final and impossible to unwind. Elias lifted his hand, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for adjusting his collar. 85 million, he said, his voice flat, emotionless, projecting just enough to reach the auctioneer. The noise of the room instantly dropped to a low, electric hum. Every head in the front row turned to locate the new bidder. Maxwell Thorne's composure faltered, the first visible crack in his polished facade. He finally twisted in his seat, his sharp eyes searching for the source of the interruption. He saw Elias, a man he didn't recognize, which in Thorne's world was a profound insult. Thorne straightened, clearly annoyed. He took a long, slow breath. 90 million, he announced, the figure delivered with the clear force of a threat. It was a power move, a declaration that the newcomer should step aside or face ruin. Elias didn't even wait for the auctioneer to repeat the figure. He simply lifted his hand again. 96 million. This was a blow. Thorne's planned profit margin was instantly evaporating. The figure was astronomical, pushing the price far beyond what any reasonable developer would pay for the immediate return. It signaled not a developer's greed, but a collector's obsession, or, in Elias's case, a lover's sacrifice. He was buying the house, but he was also buying the Kent legacy and paying an exorbitant premium for the privilege. Thorne turned fully now, his face dark, his lips thin with controlled fury. "Sir, I do not believe we have met," he growled, dispensing with the formalities. "May I ask which firm you are representing?" Elias met his gaze, an unprecedented act for a man who had spent a decade perfecting the art of the invisible stare. "I am representing my own interests, Mr. Thorne," Elias replied, the words a quiet declaration of self-made authority that was infinitely more powerful than the inherited arrogance of the Kents. Thorne stared, attempting to recognize the face, the accent, the school tie, any identifier that would place this threat within his established hierarchy. He failed. This man was outside his map. Realizing the game was no longer a formality but a genuine, costly battle, Thorne decided to end it with a decisive strike. He stood up, his massive frame dominating the space. 110 million, Thorne stated, his voice ringing with finality. It was a figure designed to make the challenger blink, to show the raw power of his liquidity and the depth of his resolve. Elias knew this was the limit of the reasonable. He had already won the psychological battle. Now he had to secure the property. He took a breath, the seconds stretching into an eternity of silence. The auctioneer's eyes darted between Thorne and Elias, sensing a massive commission on the horizon. With a calmness that was absolute, Elias raised his hand one last time. 122 million. The number hung in the air, a physical weight. It was clean, final, and crushing. Thorne's face, usually so guarded, registered pure, stunned disbelief. To go higher would be to gamble a substantial portion of his liquid assets for an emotional victory, a recklessness Thorne never indulged in. He was a financier, not a romantic fool. Thorne slowly sank back into his chair, his body rigid with defeat. He did not speak. The auctioneer, after a moment of stunned silence, seemed to regain his professional footing. He looked at the room, then at Thorne, then back at Elias. 122 million. Going once, going twice. The gavel cracked down with a sound of profound finality. Sold. To the gentleman in the back. A muffled burst of chatter erupted as the speculators and developers instantly began whispering, frantically trying to discover the identity of the mysterious bidder who had just paid an outrageous premium to secure a debt-ridden property. Elias did not indulge the curiosity. He gave a sharp nod to his waiting solicitor, Mr. Finch, and then, moving with the efficient speed he used to clear a dining table, he slipped out the back door of the hall. He vanished into the city streets, a wealthy ghost who had just engineered the most significant purchase of his life, a purchase motivated entirely by love and strategy. His priority now was to return to the Gables before anyone, especially Thorne, could connect the discreet, powerful buyer with the perfect, invisible butler. He had to be in his livery, playing his role, when Arabella finally completed her humiliation. His plan required her to believe the house was definitively lost to Maxwell Thorne, that the world had truly abandoned her. Only in that void of hopelessness could his subsequent actions, the revelation, the offering of the deed, have the necessary transformative power. He drove the hired sedan with focused intensity, changing back into his butler's uniform in the car just blocks from the estate gates. The starched linen of the shirt felt familiar, a reassuring barrier between his true, formidable identity and the performance he was about to resume. He tucked the freshly executed deed, bundled and sealed by Mr. Finch, into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket. The stiff parchment lay directly over his heart, a tangible symbol of the power he now held, power not to own Arabella, but to set her free on his terms. He slipped into the house through the servant's entrance, resuming the seamless, gliding gait of a man whose only purpose was service. He was just in time. He heard the muffled voices in the drawing room. Arabella, brittle and defensive. Thorne, cold and dismissive. He moved to the archway, positioning himself as the silent sentinel, the backdrop to her final, agonizing moments of surrender. He watched Arabella place the key in Thorne's hand, saw the cold financier pocket the last symbol of her ownership, and witnessed the utter collapse of the woman he loved. He saw the tears she swallowed, the anguish that twisted her beautiful face as she stumbled away from the home. He watched her walk out the gate and disappear down the road of her pauper's future. Elias North, the newly minted owner of the Gables, simply stood in the shadow of the archway, his hand resting lightly over the concealed deed, his heart heavy with the cost of his devotion, but firm in the certainty of his plan. The hammer had fallen, and the true cost of the mansion was only just beginning to be paid. The dust of the country road, gritty and ignoble, coated Arabella's fine blue gown and settled heavily on the thin leather of her expensive Italian boots. She walked for 2 hours, the frantic energy of her collapse having been replaced by a leaden, sickening exhaustion. The heavy gate of the Gables was now merely a distant, architectural memory, a symbol of the life that had violently ejected her. She had left with 2 suitcases, hastily packed with dresses, shoes, and a few pieces of jewelry, assets that now felt grotesquely impractical and heavy. She reached the nearest small town, a place she had driven through hundreds of times without ever acknowledging its existence beyond the fleeting impression of drab utility. Here, there were no grand avenues or manicured lawns, only closely packed brick buildings, the smell of coal smoke, and the sound of everyday human toil. It was a world entirely antithetical to her own. Her initial goal was simple: to secure a room, a temporary fortress of her own. Her remaining cash, a pitiful sum she had scrounged from her dwindling personal allowance, was enough for perhaps 2 weeks at a high-end hotel, but the thought of facing the discreet pity or, worse, the inevitable journalistic interest that would follow her to any establishment of her former standing was unbearable. She needed anonymity, not comfort. She found it in a narrow, unremarkable building above a bakery, the air perpetually thick with the scent of yeast and burnt sugar. The room, accessed by a creaking flight of stairs, was a shocking lesson in scale. It was cramped, humble, and fiercely hot from the stovepipe passing through the wall. The single window offered a view of grimy rooftops and laundry lines. The bed was narrow, the wallpaper peeling, and the washbasin chipped. For a woman who had woken every morning of her life in a room the size of this entire flat, the immediate reality of her powerlessness was a physical blow. She locked the door, dropped her 2 suitcases with a hollow thud and collapsed onto the bed. The silk sheets of the gables felt infinitely far away. The fabric of this cheap coverlet was rough against her skin. For the first 48 hours, Arabella Kent was a creature of denial and desperation. She could not comprehend the depth of her fall. She spent her time in frantic, whispered attempts to secure a lifeline. Her list of contacts, the name she had always counted on for favors, for loans, for invitations, was now a roster of people who would not return her calls. She tried Mrs. Ashworth, a woman whose entire social standing had been propped up by Arabella's family connections. "Arabella, darling, I'm so terribly sorry to hear. It's just awful," Mrs. Ashworth said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sympathy. "But really, dear, alone? My husband is simply drowning in investments right now, you understand. We simply must conserve. But do keep in touch." The line clicked dead. The keep in touch a cruel formality, ensuring Arabella knew the door was sealed. She tried 2 of her former fiancés, men who had courted her for her lineage and her anticipated fortune. Both were polite, distant, and utterly useless. They offered platitudes. "You're a strong woman, Arabella. You'll land on your feet." But no practical assistance. They saw her now for what she was, a beautifully wrapped package with no currency inside. The stark reality was that her worth had always been extrinsic, tied solely to the walls of the gables. Without them, she was a non-entity, a cautionary tale whispered over afternoon tea. The arrogance that had defined her had completely insulated her from genuine friendship. She had seen her peers not as equals, but as satellites in her orbit. Now that the central sun had gone dark, the satellites had drifted away. The money dwindled quickly. She realized, with a horrifying jolt, that she had no practical skills. She could ride, dance, speak passable French, and order a 7-course dinner. She could not, however, navigate a public bus, boil water effectively, or, most critically, earn a living. The true moment of abasement came at the end of her first week. She stared at the last few bills spread across the thin wooden table. She needed work. Her jewelry, her last remaining valuable asset, was something she fiercely clung to, knowing once that was gone, she would have nothing left to trade for hope. Her only option, suggested by the gruff but kind landlady, was to offer her services to other, slightly wealthier families in the town. Given her impeccable accent and obvious education, she was advised to try tutoring or needlework. Arabella chose needlework, a task she'd always scorned as the domain of spinsters and governesses. She secured work from a local dressmaker, Mrs. Davies, who took pity on her evident distress. The humiliation was immediate and profound. Arabella was asked to mend a tear in a simple tweed skirt, a garment she wouldn't have used as a dust cloth a month ago. Her privileged hands, accustomed only to holding champagne flutes or silk gloves, were clumsy. The needle was sharp, the thread recalcitrant, and her stitches were hopelessly uneven. Mrs. Davies watched her, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of pity and exasperation. "Dearie, you hold the needle like you expect it to bite you. It's an honest day's work, not a society pastime." Arabella felt the sting of tears, not from self-pity, but from the searing heat of shame. Her former life had left her utterly unprepared for the most basic requirements of existence. She worked for hours, her back aching, her fingertips bleeding from pricks. When she was finally paid, a paltry sum that amounted to less than the cost of one of her abandoned bath oils, she wanted to hide the coins, ashamed of the meager wage and the excruciating effort it had required. The work was a revelation. It was the first time in her life she had earned anything through true, physical application. It stripped away the illusion of her inherent value. She was worthless, not because she was penniless, but because she had never been forced to develop the resilience or skills required to survive. Her arrogance began to chip away, replaced by a raw, painful humility. She started to recognize the quiet dignity in the townspeople she encountered. The baker, the seamstress, the school teacher. They worked tirelessly, not for fun or status, but for survival, a concept that had been entirely foreign to her a few weeks prior. One evening, after another exhausting day of ruined stitches and bruised pride, she walked past a window displaying a newspaper with a bold headline about the Gables. Thorne triumphant. Fallen heiress estate to be liquidated. The article detailed the transfer of ownership, confirming Maxwell Thorne was in full control, preparing to carve the land into profitable housing plots. There was a small, unflattering picture of Arabella, taken years ago, looking bored and entitled. The cruelty of the press was a final, cold splash of water. She realized she couldn't even escape her failure in this humble room. The world was determined to use her as an object lesson in financial irresponsibility. The house was truly gone. The past was irrevocably severed. The irony of her situation was a dull ache. She, who had commanded an entire staff, was now unable to properly mend a sleeve. She, who had controlled millions, was now counting pence for a loaf of bread. In the midst of this desolate realization, a different memory surfaced, one that had been irritatingly persistent since her fall. The image of Elias North standing in the archway. He hadn't judged her. He hadn't offered pity. He had simply watched, his intense gaze holding a terrible, silent knowledge. She recalled the countless times she had ordered him around, dismissing him with a wave of her hand, forgetting his name, speaking over him as if he were a mannequin. She remembered the sharp intelligence in his eyes, the almost preternatural competence that defined his every action. She had never once thanked him properly for a decade of flawless service. The butler, the man she had regarded as furniture, had possessed more dignity, more control, and more self-made worth than she, the heiress, had ever accrued. That thought, the realization of her profound disrespect for Elias, stung worse than the hunger or the aching muscles. Her financial ruin was public. Her moral ruin was private, but it was far more devastating. Arabella sat by the small, chipped washbasin, scrubbing the grime of the day from her hands. She looked at her reflection in the cheap, cloudy mirror. The softness was gone. The entitlement was gone. What remained was a pale, tired, but oddly clear-eyed woman. The goddess was truly dead. She was utterly defeated, humbled not by abstract philosophy, but by the relentless, grinding reality of necessity. The road to humble was a brutally short one for the penniless heiress, and it had succeeded in breaking down the armor of her arrogance. She was ready now, though she did not know it, for the revelation that was about to arrive. She had lost everything. She had nothing left to protect her pride, which meant, for the first time in her life, she had something worth gaining. She would soon realize that the only man who truly saw her, not the heiress, but the broken woman, was the man she had always forced to remain invisible. And he was coming. She laid the few coins she had earned onto the table, covering them with her hand, a habit she had quickly picked up. This small, hard-won money was hers, earned by the sweat of her own brow. It was worth infinitely more than the millions she had squandered. And yet, it was barely enough to survive the next 2 days. Arabella sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of her new, impoverished reality. She did not know that, across the city, Elias North was finalizing the terms of their next encounter. An encounter that would shatter the walls of her tiny room and force her to face the true depth of the game he had been playing all along. It had been 10 days since Arabella Kent had traded the marble halls of the Gables for the cramped, odoriferous room above the bakery. 10 days of aching muscles, uneven stitches, and the grinding, humiliating necessity of counting every penny. The sharp edges of her old arrogance had been rubbed smooth by constant, small failures, replaced by a raw, painful sense of clarity. She was no longer running on adrenaline and despair. She was subsisting on cheap bread and the cold, thin gruel of reality. Her daily routine was a world away from her former life. She woke with the dawn, not to the discreet knock of a maid, but to the clang of the baker downstairs preparing the first batch of dough. She spent the morning fighting with thread and needle at Mrs. Davies' side, enduring the older woman's blunt, practical commentary on her incompetence. Her evenings were spent staring at the peeling wallpaper, rereading tattered library books, and nursing the small cuts on her fingertips. She was tired, perpetually hungry, and utterly alone, but something vital had been awakened. A grudging, fierce respect for herself. The small coins she earned through her clumsy labor felt heavier and more real than the vast, phantom millions she had once controlled. She had been humbled, yes, but in that humility, she had found a nascent core of resilience. It was on the 10th morning that the summons arrived. It was delivered not by the town postman, but by a discreet black sedan, the same type of car Maxwell Thorne favored, which instantly sent a cold spear of fear through Arabella's chest. The driver, a professional with a severe, blank face, ascended the creaking stairs and handed her a thick, sealed envelope. The paper was expensive vellum, bearing a clean, embossed seal that Arabella did not recognize. She broke the wax with a trembling hand. The note inside was brief, formal, and utterly devoid of warmth, printed in crisp black type. To Ms. Arabella Kent, you are hereby summoned to a mandatory meeting with the new owner of the property, known as the Gables, concerning matters of final settlement and disposal of specified personal effects. Date: tomorrow, 11 a.m. Location: the Gables main archway. Your attendance is required. Transportation will be provided at 10:30 a.m. The letter was signed only with a clean, hard signature that was entirely unfamiliar. Arabella's first thought was Maxwell Thorne. It had to be. He had won the house, but perhaps he intended one last, cruel victory, forcing her to negotiate for some small heirloom he hadn't yet catalogued, or perhaps offering a conditional pittance to settle her final debts, thereby forcing her to publicly grovel. She imagined a cold, sterile meeting in the library, Thorne watching her across a massive table, his eyes full of triumph. A wave of nausea hit her. Her humiliation, it seemed, was not yet complete. But she had no choice. She was legally obliged to attend, and more importantly, she desperately needed to see if there was any chance, however slight, of recovering her mother's old music box, an item of sentiment she had forgotten to pack. She spent the remainder of the day steeling herself, rehearsing lines of dignity, preparing for the inevitable wave of shame. She chose the blue gown again. It was her finest garment, and she needed every visual advantage she could muster to stand before the financier who had destroyed her. The next morning, the black sedan was waiting precisely at 10:30 a.m. Arabella climbed in, feeling like a prisoner being transported to her own sentencing. The drive was short, agonizingly familiar, yet utterly strange. As the car turned into the long, winding drive of the Gables, she felt the weight of 10 days' worth of pain crash down on her. The property still looked magnificent, if slightly neglected, its beauty a mockery of her poverty. The car stopped directly at the massive, arched entrance of the main hall. This was the same archway where she had seen Elias North standing the day she left, a silent, dark figure watching her downfall. She stepped out of the car, adjusting her worn gloves. Her heart was pounding, her throat tight with fear. She took a deep breath, prepared to walk into the silent, imposing hall and face Maxwell Thorne. But Thorne was not there. Instead, standing alone in the deep shadow of the archway, framed by the wrought iron scrollwork, was a man. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a stillness that commanded attention. He was no longer wearing the black livery of a butler. He was dressed in a suit of charcoal gray wool, expertly tailored to his broad shoulders, a quiet, powerful display of expensive cloth and precise fit. His white shirt was crisp, his cravat tied with an elegant, deliberate knot. He looked not merely wealthy, but fundamentally powerful, a man who navigated the highest echelons of finance and society with quiet confidence. His posture was familiar, the straight, disciplined back and the innate grace of movement, the characteristics of a man who held his own dignity fiercely. Arabella froze at the foot of the steps. The face was the same. The keen, thoughtful expression, the intense brown eyes that had always seemed to hold a world of silent judgment and knowledge. It was all devastatingly familiar. It was Elias North. He was not in costume. This was not a servant. This was the man beneath the livery, and the transformation was so complete, so utterly unexpected, that Arabella felt dizzy. She stared, utterly speechless, the name Elias forming silently on her tongue, but unable to escape. The humiliation she had felt over the last 10 days was instantly eclipsed by this terrifying, astonishing revelation. Elias did not move. He simply waited, allowing the full shock of his presence and his changed status to register. He did not smile, nor did he offer a greeting. His eyes, fixed on her face, conveyed a profound mixture of regret for her suffering and an ironclad determination. "Miss Kent," Elias finally said. His voice the same quiet, measured baritone she remembered, but now entirely stripped of the subservient polish of a butler. It was the voice of a man who commanded respect, not requested it. "Thank you for attending." Arabella found her voice, a strained, thin whisper. "Elias? What are you doing here? Where is Mr. Thorne? Are you working for him now?" The question was desperate, a last attempt to fit him back into the only box she knew. A flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps, crossed Elias's face. "Mr. Thorne is not here, Arabella," he corrected her, using her first name for the first time in their lives, a familiarity that felt utterly foreign and intensely personal. "And I am not working for anyone." He took one deliberate step forward, his suit catching the light, moving him slightly out of the archway's shadow. "I am the new owner of the Gables." The statement was not a question, not a boast, but a quiet, irrefutable declaration of fact. Arabella swayed on the steps, clutching the strap of her small, pathetic handbag. The cool, calculated authority of his words shattered the last of her carefully maintained denial. Thorne hadn't bought it. The mysterious, high-bidding buyer who had broken Thorne's confidence had been Elias, her invisible butler. The weight of the last 10 days, the hungry nights, the bleeding fingertips, the agony of being dismissed by her former friends, suddenly made perfect, brutal sense. Elias had been watching her fall, and all the while, he had held the power to stop it, to save her. But he had chosen not to. He had allowed her to suffer, had orchestrated the complete destruction of her life, and had then bought the ruins back. The shame was overwhelming. Not just shame at her poverty, but shame at her colossal blindness. For 10 years, she had treated a man of such sharp intellect and staggering financial power as a piece of scenery. "You," Arabella began, the word catching in her throat, a mixture of accusation and raw disbelief. "You let me. You watched me lose everything." Elias inclined his head, a gesture of deep, formal respect that felt more like a judgment. "I watched you, Arabella, as I have watched you for 10 years. I watched you lose your inheritance, your home, and your father's respect through carelessness and misplaced confidence. I could not stop the momentum of the debt. But the house—" He paused, his eyes piercing hers with an almost painful intensity. "The house I secured, it is mine now." He reached into the breast pocket of his perfectly tailored suit, the pocket she had once seen contain a white linen handkerchief, now containing something infinitely more valuable. He pulled out a folded packet of parchment, thick and sealed. "You have come for a final settlement," Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, powerful register. "The settlement is here." He descended the last step, closing the distance between them, the humble heiress and the powerful, self-made man. He held the packet out to her, the final, absolute evidence of his ownership. "We have much to discuss, Arabella," Elias concluded. "But the first thing you must understand is that the role of servant is finished. Today you must look at me, and you must see your new master." The implication of that word, master, hung between them, not a master of the house, but a master of her fate. Arabella took the deed, her fingers trembling against the smooth, cold paper. The reality of the transaction, the astonishing depth of his deception, and the terrifying prospect of his terms had fully arrived. She was standing at the archway, no longer leaving the Gables, but about to re-enter it under conditions that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. Arabella stood motionless on the steps, the parchment of the deed cold and heavy in her hand, a burden far heavier than the worn-out handbag she carried. The document was real. The seal was official. The fact of Elias's ownership was undeniable. Her mind struggled to reconcile the image of the man before her, the commanding figure in the tailored suit, radiating competence and wealth, with the memory of the butler, silent and subservient, who had held her coat and opened her car door. The dissonance was violent, a dizzying collapse of her worldview. "You are the new owner," Arabella managed, her voice cracking as she spoke the words out loud, finally acknowledging the scale of her blindness. "The man who outbid Thorne. It was you." Elias inclined his head again, a deliberate, patient gesture. "It was I, Arabella. I have owned the Gables for the last 10 days, and I was the only person who possessed the funds, the speed, and the sheer dedication to prevent Maxwell Thorne from turning this estate into a subdivision." He stepped past her, indicating she should follow him into the silent drawing room. The furniture was now covered in protective dust sheets, the air hushed and still. It was the same room where she had handed the keys to Thorne, but the energy was entirely different. No longer the cold atmosphere of corporate liquidation, but a tense, intimate space of revelation. Arabella followed him, her worn boots silent on the marble floor. Elias walked not with the rapid, efficient pace of a servant, but with the measured confidence of a proprietor, a man utterly comfortable in his domain. He stopped near the massive fireplace, resting his arm on the mantelpiece. A casual, proprietary gesture that seemed to claim the house not just legally, but spiritually. "Sit, Arabella," he instructed, his voice gentle yet firm, indicating a simple, straight-backed chair that had been uncovered. "We are no longer client and servant. We are two adults, discussing a matter of immense complexity. You have earned the right to hear the truth, unvarnished." Arabella sat, the rigid posture of the chair forcing her to maintain her dignity, despite the chaotic storm raging inside her. Elias began to speak, his gaze fixed on the empty grate, recounting the story of his secret life with a calm, methodical precision that was utterly chilling. He did not boast, he simply stated facts. "For 10 years, I was invisible to you," he started. "That was my choice, but it was also your habit. You saw the livery, the title. You never once saw the man beneath. I came to the Gables already possessing a keen mind for finance, born not of inherited lessons, but of sheer, grinding necessity. While I served your dinner, I was charting commodity futures. While I drove you to your pointless social engagements, I was calculating trade routes. Every single instruction you gave me, every document you carelessly left on a table, every overheard conversation became data." His eyes finally met hers, sharp and unwavering. "Your family was dying a death of beautiful neglect and expensive illusions. You, Arabella, were the most beautiful and most oblivious illusion of all. I watched you sign away your assets, one by one, chasing fleeting pleasures. I watched you rely entirely on the premise that the money would always be there, simply because you were a Kent." Arabella flinched, the words striking her with the force of physical blows. The humiliation of the last 10 days was now compounded by the agonizing realization that the butler had been the only truly competent person in the entire house, while she had been the fool. My wealth was earned through discipline, strategic risk, and years of patient, quiet growth in shipping and commodities. Elias continued, his voice hardening slightly. I realized 3 years ago that the house was doomed. No one, not even a loan shark, could have stopped the momentum of your father's borrowing and your own spending. So I chose not to intervene. I chose to wait for the complete collapse. He paused, letting the silence accuse her. Because I loved you, Arabella. Not the arrogant heiress, but the brilliant woman I saw flashes of beneath the entitlement. I knew that woman could only be freed when the entitled one was destroyed. You had to lose the house to realize the value of a single honest penny, which you have now earned with Mrs. Davies. Arabella gasped, the reference to her humiliating work confirming the depth of his surveillance. You knew I was sewing? You knew where I was staying. I know everything, Arabella. I have always been your guardian angel, quietly arranging for certain disasters to be merely catastrophic, not fatal. But I could not give you the house back until you had humbled yourself enough to earn it. He walked away from the mantelpiece, holding the deed, now a symbol of his authority and her desperation. He stopped directly in front of her. And so we come to the settlement. His tone was now strictly businesslike, but the intensity in his eyes was deeply personal. The Gables is mine, Arabella. I paid an outrageous sum for it, a sum that ensured it would be free from further legal challenge. He held the deed out, not offering it as a gift, but holding it as a test. I did not buy this house to liquidate it. I bought it for you, but you will not take it back as the heiress. You will take it back as my partner. Arabella frowned, confusion warring with her residual shock. Partner? You mean a loan? A business arrangement? Elias's jaw tightened. I mean a partnership of equals, Arabella. I mean that the era of service between us is over. I am a self-made man, a successful man. You will not view me as a servant, nor as a benefactor. You will view me as the man who owns this home and the man who intends to marry you. The word marry exploded in the quiet room. Arabella shot out of the chair, forgetting her exhaustion and her humility, the old indignation flaring up like a struck match. Marry me? She cried, her voice trembling with anger. Is this a rescue or a purchase? You buy my house and then demand my hand? This is not partnership, Elias, this is leverage. This is revenge for every slight you endured. Elias stood his ground, unperturbed by her fury. It is neither, Arabella. It is a non-negotiable condition. You cannot afford to live here as a tenant. I will not give it to you as charity. I offer it as the foundation of our life together. My terms are as follows. First, the house is hers, but the deed remains in my name until you meet the final conditions. You will live here, but you will not spend without my explicit approval. Second, you will become my partner in the estate management. You will learn every ledger, every contract, every debt and asset of the Gables from the ground up. You will learn the value of money and labor. You will work harder than you ever did sewing sleeves for Mrs. Davies. Third, you will accept me as your equal partner, and eventually your husband. The marriage will not take place until you can look at me, Elias North, the former butler, and truly see your equal. Until you can respect me for the man I am, not the role I played. You will be my fiancée, my partner, and the mistress of this home under my supervision. He delivered the conditions with the cold finality of a legal contract. He was giving her everything she wanted, her home, but taking away the only thing she had left, her class prejudice. If you refuse, Elias concluded, folding the deed and slipping it back into his pocket, you will leave immediately, and I will proceed with selling the land to Thorne, who is already waiting for my failure. You will return to your room above the bakery, and the Gables will be destroyed. Arabella stood before him, the blue dress suddenly feeling flimsy and powerless. She looked at the fireplace, imagining the house torn apart by developers. She looked at Elias, the sheer, undeniable reality of his intelligence and his power radiating from him. He had stripped her of everything, but he had done it to force her to choose a future based on character, not birthright. The choice was impossible, agonizing. To accept was to swallow the bitterest pill of humility, to marry the man she had treated as less than human. To refuse was to destroy her home and condemn herself to a life of utter poverty and failure. "You are forcing me," she whispered, her pride in tatters. "I am forcing you to choose between your pride and your future." Elias corrected her, his voice softening slightly, a hint of the desperate love beneath the steel. "Choose the woman you have become over the one you were, Arabella. Say you will stay. Say you will accept my hand, and together we will save this house." Arabella stared into his eyes, seeing not the butler, but the master strategist, the devoted, formidable man who had engineered her life to save her soul. She looked down at her hands, the rough skin on her fingers a testament to the price of her recent lessons. She had nothing left to lose but her prejudice. She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. She still couldn't say the word love, but she could say the word that mattered most. "I accept your terms, Elias," she said, the commitment a wrenching, final break from her past. "I will be your partner, and I will earn back my home." The single word "master" echoed in the vast, sheet-draped silence of the drawing room. It was the word that detonated Arabella's hard-won humility and ignited the last, desperate flare of her old-class pride. Her initial shock at his revelation had been paralyzing, but his conditions, the brazen, calculated audacity of demanding her hand in marriage as the price for her home, yanked her out of her stupor. The woman who had patiently sewed sleeves for pence was momentarily buried beneath the resurrected spirit of the imperious heiress. She snatched the deed, which Elias had placed in her hand, and threw it with all her strength against the marble fireplace. It struck the stone with a sharp, papery slap, skittering across the floor like a wounded bird. "How dare you?" she spat, her voice ringing with the genuine, unadulterated fury of a woman of status who has been grossly insulted. "You call this a partnership? You call this love? It is blackmail, Elias. It is the most calculated act of revenge a servant could devise. For 10 years, I treated you as you insisted on being treated, as a function. And now you believe that by buying my house, you have purchased my person." She advanced on him, her eyes blazing, the exhaustion of the last 10 days momentarily forgotten. Her blue gown, which had seemed so pitiful moments ago, now looked like the uniform of a justified fury. "You stood in the archway and watched me leave this house, ruined and terrified," she continued, her voice rising. "You knew where I was, working for scraps, humiliating myself, and you did not lift a finger. You allowed my pride to be stripped bare, and now you present yourself as the savior, demanding my hand as your reward. Do you think so little of me that you believe a roof over my head is enough to make me marry the man who poured my coffee?" Elias did not flinch. He stood perfectly still, his tailored suit a barrier of impervious calm against her tempest. He waited until her immediate blast of indignation had subsided, then spoke in a voice that was low, measured, and infinitely more cutting than her hysteria. "Did you think so much of me, Arabella, that you believed I was incapable of earning this house myself?" He countered, his brown eyes locking onto hers with a devastating clarity. "Did you think I was so vapid that 10 years of my life could be reduced to a footnote in your own tragedy? No. I endured your arrogance because it was a means to an end. My refusal to intervene was not revenge. It was the last act of service I could perform for you." He walked past her and calmly retrieved the deed from the floor, smoothing the crease where it had struck the marble. "You claim I am using your distress. Let me show you what distress truly looks like, Arabella," Elias said, his voice now entirely devoid of emotion, strictly professional. He moved to the nearest covered table, pulling back the sheet to reveal a large, leather-bound volume, the Kent family's principal ledger, which he had clearly been reviewing. He opened the book and pushed it toward her. "The distress, Arabella, is here," he stated, tapping a clean fingernail against a column marked in stark, bleeding red ink. "These are the final figures of the Kent estate. The total debt, including interest penalties and Thorne's leveraged fees, totaled $78 million. You squandered every asset, every bond, every piece of collateral. You leveraged the house until it was nothing but a massive liability. Did I watch? Yes. Did I stop it? No. Because you were incapable of recognizing the disaster until it consumed you." He turned the page to a detailed schedule of her personal expenditures over the last 3 years, figures he had tracked from petty cash requests and bank statements. "Look at this," he commanded, pointing to a single figure. The cost of the unnecessary stable of Spanish horses she had bought on a whim. That amount 3 years ago was enough to pay off the principal interest on the largest family loan. Had you diverted that one purchase, your father would have remained solvent. You chose the horses. He turned another page, showing the cumulative cost of her jewelry, her clothes, her parties. "This," he stated, tapping the page, "is not arrogance. This is neglect. This is a profound, willful disregard for the legacy you inherited, and a spectacular disrespect for the people who worked beneath you, including me, to maintain the illusion of that wealth." Arabella stared at the figures. The sight of the cold, hard numbers laid bare, the raw, undeniable reality of her catastrophic irresponsibility, was infinitely more painful than the insults of her former society friends. She saw now, starkly illuminated by Elias's brutal honesty, that she hadn't just been a reckless girl. She had been an active agent of destruction. Her hands, the hands that still carried the scars of her recent, clumsy sewing attempts, trembled as she traced the lines of red ink. She remembered haughtily asking Elias to fetch the ledger, never even glancing at the totals, so convinced was she of her immunity. Elias pressed his advantage, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "When I stood in that archway, watching you walk away, I wasn't thinking of revenge for my bruised ego. I was thinking, finally, she can see the cost of her life. I bought this house for a price well over $100 million, not to own you, but to provide you with a new foundation. A foundation built not on Kent's sentiment, but on North's stability. And my demand for marriage is not to purchase a wife, but to secure an equal partnership." He stepped back, crossing his arms. "You despised the idea of marrying me because I was your butler, because I stood by the sideboard while you destroyed your future. Your pride, Arabella, is still more valuable to you than your freedom. I am offering you back your home, provided you discard the very prejudice that cost you that home in the first place." The last defenses of her arrogance crumbled. She looked away from the ledger, unable to bear the truth it contained, and she looked at Elias. She saw the wealth, yes, but she also saw the immense discipline, the quiet dedication, and the frighteningly competent mind that had been serving her tea. He had not only earned his own fortune but had mastered the intricate affairs of her family while she indulged in distractions. She had been the truly lowly one, reliant on inherited status, while he was the self-made king. The shame was overwhelming. It wasn't the shame of being poor. It was the burning, agonizing shame of having treated a magnificent, formidable man like a shadow. She realized that every time she had dismissed him, every time she had spoken over him, she had only exposed her own shallowness and lack of perception. Arabella started, the word catching on a painful lump in her throat. "I truly believed. You were invisible. You believed I was invisible because you chose to be blind," Elias corrected her, his expression finally softening, a slight, almost pained empathy entering his eyes. "But I forgive you the blindness, Arabella. Now you must forgive yourself and choose to see." She stood up, pushing the ledger away. She couldn't breathe in this room of exposed secrets and shattering truths. The full weight of the past 10 days, the humiliation, the fear, the hunger, combined with the profound new realization of her moral failure. "I need to leave," she choked out, her carefully maintained composure finally breaking. She didn't run. She walked quickly to the main doors, seeking escape not from Elias, but from the brutal mirror he had held up to her soul. Elias did not try to stop her. He knew she needed time for the truth to settle, for the last remnants of her entitlement to be burned away by the heat of her shame. "The car will take you back to your lodgings," Elias stated, his voice a final, solemn promise. "You have 24 hours to make your decision, Arabella. Until then, you are under my protection, but you are not yet free." Arabella nodded curtly, unable to speak, and fled the gables for the second time. As she was driven away, she clutched the single piece of fabric she had brought with her. A small, badly mended scrap of Mrs. Davies' tweed, a harsh, painful reminder of the poverty she had endured and the work she had despised. She returned to her cramped room, not with the anger of the heiress, but with the profound, devastating humility of a woman who had finally seen her own moral bankruptcy reflected in the eyes of the man she had wronged. The agony of accepting Elias's proposal was immense, but the agony of returning to the life of an indebted pauper, knowing the cost of her past choices, was now far greater. The battle for the Gables was over. The battle for Arabella's soul was just beginning. Arabella Kent did not sleep that night. She returned to her cramped, cheap room above the bakery, the scent of stale bread and the intrusive street noise replacing the oppressive silence of the Gables. She sat bolt upright on the narrow, uncomfortable bed, the deed, the thick official parchment, lying on the table where she had dropped it, a single, devastating piece of evidence. The hours passed not in rest, but in a relentless, agonizing war between the two opposing forces in her soul. The desperate, entitled Arabella of the past, and the humbled, terrified, newly awakened woman. The past Arabella screamed at the injustice. "How dare he, a servant, a man who cleaned my silver, presume to make me his wife? This is not love. It is insolence. My freedom, my lineage, they are worth more than his ill-gotten fortune." This voice demanded she cling to the small, miserable dignity of her class, even if it meant starving on the streets. The new woman, the one forged by 10 days of manual labor and shame, whispered the cold, hard truth. "What freedom? You have no freedom. Your lineage is worthless without the fortune that sustained it. Elias is offering you a hand up, not a handout. He is offering you a chance to repair the very thing you broke, but only if you destroy the flaw that caused the breakage in the first place." She grappled with the two realities of her choice. Reality 1, independence and poverty. She could refuse Elias, walk away from the Gables forever, and return to her life of poorly paid sewing. It would be a life of true independence, free from obligation, but it would also be a life defined by grinding want, perpetual anonymity, and the slow, lonely death of her spirit. She would be forever defined by her loss, a ghost haunting the edges of society. She would never see the Gables again, knowing Maxwell Thorne, the true villain of her tragedy, would eventually carve it up and destroy its memory. Reality 2, partnership and humility. She could accept Elias's terms. She would gain back her home, but she would lose her most cherished illusion, her social superiority. She would be forced into an equal partnership, learning to work and manage alongside a man she had once treated as invisible. She would be forced to marry him, trading the empty security of her old class for the complicated, earned security of his self-made fortune. As the night wore on, the weight of the ledger's truth became unbearable. Elias had not just shown her a balance sheet. He had shown her a portrait of her own character, lazy, entitled, and incapable of true responsibility. She remembered the feel of the needle pricking her finger, the literal, physical pain of her effort. She compared that honest ache to the careless signature she had affixed to countless ruinous documents. Elias's offer was not revenge. It was therapy. He wasn't asking her to be subservient to him. He was asking her to be subservient to work, to responsibility, and to the fundamental truth that he, the butler, was a man of more substance and worth than any of the titled, worthless men she had courted. The ultimate moment of clarity came just before dawn. Arabella walked to the small window and watched the baker light his ovens below, the first wisp of wood smoke drifting up into the cold, clean air. She realized the essential difference between herself and Elias. She had been born rich and grown poor. He had been born with nothing and had made himself rich through relentless effort. His fortune was not a loan or a gift. It was the embodiment of his character. If she married him, she would be partnering with the very definition of worth. Her heart, which had been frozen with fear and pride, finally began to thaw, replaced by a deep, grudging respect for the man. He hadn't just saved her home. He had forced her to save herself. She made her choice. It was not a choice made out of love or even happiness, but out of a profound, cold-hearted recognition of necessity, humility, and the desperate desire for redemption. She washed her face, smoothing her blue dress with a renewed sense of purpose. She had no maid, no carriage, no pretense left. She would go to the gables and face the man she was now pledged to. Before leaving the cramped room, Arabella made one final stop. She descended the stairs not to the bakery, but to the small, untended community garden plot behind the building. The garden was neglected, but a few hardy, late-season flowers were struggling to bloom. Simple, common things, unlike the exotic, expensive blooms grown in the hothouses of the gables. She plucked a single, small, humble white flower, its petals slightly bruised. It was not a gift of love, but a symbol of her new life, a life of small, earned, necessary things. She walked the familiar road back to the mansion, the journey feeling entirely different this time. She walked as a supplicant, not an owner, a woman walking toward her destiny, not away from her disaster. She arrived at the massive iron gates of the gables precisely at 11 a.m., the exact time Elias had appointed for their meeting. The gates were closed. She pressed the old, familiar intercom buzzer. A voice, not the servant's voice she remembered, but a crisp, new security detail's voice, answered. "Yes, I am Arabella Kent. I am here to see Mr. North." She gave his name its full weight, acknowledging his status. The gates swung open. Elias was not waiting for her in the formality of the archway this time. He was standing on the lawn, near the same fountain where she had collapsed in despair days ago, speaking quietly with a stern-looking man who held blueprints. He was still in his impeccable suit, conducting the business of his new domain. She walked across the lawn toward him, her footsteps slow and deliberate. Elias saw her approach and dismissed the other man with a nod. He turned to face her, his expression serious, waiting. Arabella stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the lack of sleep in her eyes, the raw humility in her posture. She held the small, simple white flower out to him, her hand trembling slightly. "I have made my choice, Elias," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I accept your conditions. Every single one." Elias took the flower from her hand, his fingers brushing hers. A formal, intimate touch. He looked at the flower, then back at her. "The humility, Arabella," he said, his voice low, "is the hardest part to counterfeit. Are you certain this acceptance is genuine? Are you ready to see me as your equal?" "I am ready to see you as my superior," Arabella admitted, the admission tasting like ash in her mouth. "You are more capable, more disciplined, and more worthy of this house than I ever was. The debt I truly owe you is not financial. It is for the debt of my own moral bankruptcy." She took a deep breath, reciting the words that had been rehearsed 1,000 times in the dark silence of her room. The words that would officially sever her from her old life. "I want to be your partner, Elias," she stated, emphasizing the word. "I want to work with you to restore the Kent name not through lineage, but through earned worth. I will learn the ledgers. I will abide by your counsel. I will accept your protection and your hand, not as a debtor or a wife purchased in a bargain, but as a woman seeking redemption. Elias looked at her for a long, silent moment. The fury was gone. The tears were gone. Only stark, fierce determination remained in her eyes. He knew this moment was the truth, the core of the woman he had silently devoted his life to saving. He looked down at the simple white flower in his hand, a symbol of everything she had gained in the ashes of her life. He tucked it carefully into his breast pocket, next to the deed, sealing the contract. "Then welcome home, Arabella," Elias said, the warmth in his voice a profound shock. He reached out his hand, not to command, but to guide. "Let us begin your education." Arabella placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly real. For the first time since she had walked away from the Gables, she felt the heavy burden of her past lift, replaced by the crushing, terrifying weight of her future. She was no longer the fallen heiress. She was the fiancée of the butler, and the journey to earning her way back to herself had just begun. 3 months had passed since Arabella Kent had walked back into the Gables and exchanged her humiliation for a terrifying, conditional future. The house, under Elias North's firm but measured direction, was no longer a vessel of neglect but a machine of purposeful activity. The financial hemorrhage had been stanched, and the systematic restoration of the estate had begun. But the most profound transformation had occurred not in the house, but in its mistress. Arabella was unrecognizable. The entitled carelessness that had once defined her posture was gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a woman deeply engaged in arduous labor. She was no longer dressed in the lavish, impractical gowns of her past, nor the humble tweed of her brief pauperdom. She favored simple, elegant silk day dresses, deep emeralds, rich crimsons, garments that were fine but functional, chosen for their practicality over their expense. They were the uniform of a woman of substance, not status. Her education under Elias had been rigorous and unforgiving. He had started her not in the opulent master's study, but in the small, cramped estate office where he had once quietly managed the household's chaotic affairs. Day after day, she sat opposite him at the massive mahogany desk, immersed in ledgers, contracts, and forecasts. The same books she had dismissed as too ugly to read now occupied her every thought. Elias was a patient but demanding tutor. He taught her not just how to read a balance sheet, but how to think like a financier, to predict risk, leverage assets, and understand the true cost of every transaction. He corrected her mistakes with a calm finality that was far more effective than any shout. "You treat money like an opinion, Arabella," he would say, tapping the ledger. "It is not. It is a tool. You must understand its nature, or it will always master you." Arabella learned. She learned the value of a shilling, the calculation of interest, and the subtle art of negotiation. She discovered an innate, suppressed intelligence for commerce, a sharp wit that had been entirely wasted on society gossip. She began to appreciate the work, the elegant, satisfying logic of making order out of chaos, a pleasure she had never known when money simply appeared on demand. Their dynamic was a tense, charged blend of tutor and student, proprietor and partner, and slowly, glacially, fiancé and fiancée. Elias maintained a scrupulous, formal distance in his interactions, always addressing her with a respectful formality that underscored their new equality. He did not press her for affection, knowing that her commitment had to be forged in respect, not gratitude. He lived by the terms of their agreement, partner, not debtor. But in the quiet evenings, after the ledgers were closed, the intimacy of their shared purpose was undeniable. They would take their dinner in the small breakfast nook, discussing trade policy or the cost of new roofing tiles. In those moments, Arabella saw beyond the tailored suit and the formal restraint, recognizing the fierce intelligence and the devoted heart of the man who had loved her from the shadows. She felt not just respect, but a deep, burgeoning admiration. a feeling more complex and durable than the fleeting infatuation she had known in her old life. She was learning to love the man she had been forced to see. The true test of their new partnership arrived on a cold December afternoon. Arabella was reviewing the final, complex agreement for the sale of a small, unused parcel of land, a negotiation she had handled entirely on her own, when Elias's new security officer informed them they had an uninvited visitor at the gates. It was Maxwell Thorne. Elias looked at Arabella, a faint, challenging question in his eyes. He claims he is here to finalize a last detail regarding the old transfer. He is not. He is here to assess the new ownership. Arabella felt a flash of the old fear, but it was quickly replaced by a solid, righteous anger. Thorne was the symbol of her utter failure. To face him now, standing on the ground he believed he had conquered, was the ultimate confrontation. "I will handle it," Arabella said, rising from her chair, her posture straight and resolute. "It is my debt to finish." She met Thorne in the drawing room, the same room where she had handed him the keys months ago. The difference was stunning. The dust sheets were gone, the room was polished, and a massive fire roared in the hearth. Arabella did not wait for him to be seated. Thorne, looking severe and complacent, stopped short when he saw her. He had expected to see Elias, the anonymous wealthy bidder. He had not expected to see Arabella, glowing with competence, standing on her own ground. "Ms. Kent," Thorne said, his tone laced with patronizing curiosity, "I am surprised to see you still at the Gables. I was led to believe the new owner was rather meticulous." "He is," Arabella replied, her voice cool and perfectly modulated, devoid of any desperation. She offered no greeting, no apology. "Mr. North is busy. I am his managing partner. How may I help you with this last detail, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne's eyes narrowed. He looked past her, searching for Elias. "I need to speak with the owner regarding a small discrepancy in the transfer documentation. It's a matter of some consequence, certainly too much for a domestic partner." Arabella smiled, a small, genuine, confident curve of her lips that made her look formidable. "If the matter is financial, Mr. Thorne, I assure you I am fully authorized and entirely competent. If it is personal, I assure you I am also the correct person to speak with." She paused, letting the implication of her engagement sink in. "Perhaps you can simply state your business, or I will ask the security detail to escort you out." Thorne, unused to being dismissed by a woman, let alone the one he had ruined, pushed back, his voice taking on a sharper, more challenging edge. "The fact is, Ms. Kent, I have been informed that Mr. North is the man who secured this property at auction. I still have a standing offer that exceeds his purchase price, should he be inclined to liquidate after this peculiar arrangement runs its course. I suggest he takes it." Arabella walked to the small table and picked up the bound ledger she had been working on, a prop and a weapon. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone shifting from polite dismissal to cold, financial command. "You are suggesting that the current owner, who purchased this property for $122 million, would sell it to you, who failed to secure it, for a minimal profit, simply because you find his arrangements peculiar?" She opened the ledger, tapping the figures within. "Let me show you a last detail. I have reviewed the debt schedule that cost my family this house. The true mismanagement came not from the Kents, but from the highly leveraged, high-risk, undisclosed interest fees your firm applied. This estate is now being run conservatively, profitably, and without leverage. My husband-to-be has no need for your speculative profit, and I have no interest in dealing with the man who nearly destroyed my life. The matter is closed. Do not return to the Gables." She closed the ledger with a deliberate snap, the sound echoing in the restored silence of the room. She was not begging. She was not negotiating. She was delivering a verdict. Thorne was beaten, not by Elias's wealth, but by Arabella's competence and newly discovered courage. He saw that the woman before him was no longer the arrogant, careless heiress. She was a genuine, formidable partner. The opportunity for him to profit or cause further disruption was gone. "You have made your point, Miss Kent," Thorne said stiffly, acknowledging the defeat with a sharp nod. He turned and left the drawing room, the sound of his retreating footsteps signaling the absolute end of the external conflict. When the front door closed, Arabella leaned back against the mantelpiece, letting out a long, shaky breath. The confrontation had taken every ounce of her new strength, but she had stood her ground, and she had won. A moment later, Elias appeared in the doorway. He had been listening from the adjacent hall, watching the final act of her transformation. He walked toward her, and this time, there was no tutor, no proprietor, only a man looking at the woman he loved. "You handled him with the skill of a seasoned veteran," Elias said, his eyes filled with a pride that made her heart ache. "You conquered your debt, Arabella, and you have fully earned the title of managing partner." Arabella met his gaze, the last vestiges of her pride dissolving. She had earned her home back not through his money, but through her own work. She had earned his respect, and in doing so, she had earned her own. "I could not have done it without the lessons of the past 3 months," she confessed, her voice soft. "Thank you, Elias. Thank you for making me see." Elias reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, simple white flower she had given him months ago, now pressed and dried, preserving its small, vital memory. He placed it gently in her hand. "The work is finished, Arabella. The debt is settled," Elias whispered. "The conditions of our partnership have been met. There is only one final formality remaining." He pulled the deed from his inside jacket pocket, unfolded it, and instead of holding it, he walked to the massive hearth where the fire was roaring. Arabella watched, her breath caught in her throat. Elias held the deed over the flames. Then slowly, deliberately, he tore the heavy parchment in half. He was destroying the symbol of their contract, the last piece of leverage he held over her. "The house is no longer mine, Arabella," he said, placing the 2 torn halves into her hands. "It is now entirely ours. And the proposal is no longer a condition of ownership. It is a request from a man to the woman he loves." He dropped to one knee on the rug before the blazing fire, a profound, solemn gesture for a man who had only ever bowed in service. He pulled a small, elegant velvet box from his pocket, opening it to reveal a simple, stunning sapphire ring, chosen not for its size, but for the depth of its color. "Arabella Kent," he said, his voice deep with emotion, "I do not need your compliance. I need your heart given freely. Will you marry me, not as the price of this home, but as the beginning of our life together?" Arabella's eyes flooded with tears, tears of relief, love, and immense gratitude. She looked at the torn deed in her hand, then at the man before her, no longer the servant, no longer the master, but her equal, her partner, her beginning. "Yes, Elias," she whispered, a fierce, final affirmation of the life she had earned. "I will marry you, and I promise you, I will be the partner you deserve." Elias rose, placing the ring on her finger. A simple, elegant band that sealed a bond forged not in privilege, but in humility and shared strength. They stood together in the heart of the great mansion, the flames of the hearth illuminating their faces. The Gables was saved, not by an heiress, but by a self-made woman and the low-born man who had dared to love her enough to teach her the true price of worth. The new era had begun. The end.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.